Hello, and welcome to the Water Buffs podcast, featuring in-depth interviews with experts discussing water problems and solutions. You'll find the audio version of this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. The video version is available on YouTube and Vimeo. Water Buffs is a production of The Water Desk, an independent journalism initiative based at the University of Colorado Boulder's Center for Environmental Journalism. Stay tuned until the end for more information. We hope you enjoy the show.
To keep it simple, the root of the issues we're seeing now are the legacy of racism and underfunding across the country, specifically for Indigenous communities.
Hello, and welcome to the Water Buffs podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Tobin, Director of the Water Desk at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm excited to be speaking today to Kaitlin Harris, Field Engineer at DigDeep's Navajo Water Project. Kaitlin is an engineer, anthropologist, and longtime social justice ally. Her work focuses on place-based partnerships and supporting rural community livelihoods. She has worked across the Navajo Nation, rural Utah, and small communities in Brazil. As the field engineer for the Navajo Water Project, which is part of DigDeep Water, she works with community members, Navajo Nation partners, and DigDeep staff to design solutions for long-term water access across the Navajo Nation. Welcome to the show, Kaitlin. It's great to have you with us.
Thanks so much. So excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. Well, to begin with, it would be helpful to learn a little bit about the work of DigDeep and the Navajo Water Project and your mission.
Yeah, absolutely. So DigDeep is a nonprofit that was founded in 2011 in Los Angeles, and initially was working in international communities on water access, developing wells. But in about 5 or 6 years ago, someone approached George, our CEO and founder, and said, I want to donate to your organization, but I want you to work 2 states over in New Mexico in the community that I'm from that doesn't have running water. And that's when the Navajo Water Project was born. So our long-term mission on the Navajo Water Project is to provide families with hot and cold running water and sanitation facilities on the Navajo Nation. 30% of Navajo Nation residents don't have access to hot and cold running water or sanitation. And our mission is to be a part of the solution and working alongside our community partners to fill that gap and connect families to running water. Our projects really center community leadership and collaboration. We partner with local community partners across our 3 project sites and hire locally from within the community. And it has looked, long-term a lot different than it's looked in the past year and a half with COVID. Long-term, we help develop watering points in communities. We create a water trucking route and install simple cistern systems in homes that consist of a 1,200-gallon tank, a water pump, a water heater, a sink, a solar panel, a water expansion tank, like a pretty simple sink system, and then work with the community partner to develop a consistent water delivery route. We also support water extension line projects in New Mexico, which is kind of a new pilot project that we've been doing. But the past year and a half with the pandemic has looked really different. We have been prioritizing emergency water delivery and supporting communities outside of the 3 communities that we work in. The Navajo Nation is about the size of West Virginia, and we work across all 3 states in southern Utah in Natzitzan or Navajo Mountain, in Dilcon, Arizona, and then over and through New Mexico, which is our longest project site. So we have a lot of moving parts, and especially in the last year and a half with the pandemic, a lot of has changed and happened.
Mm-hmm. Great. So tell us a little bit about the challenges related to water on the Navajo Nation in terms of the water supply and the quality of the water.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd say there's a variety of layers here when it comes to water on the Navajo Nation. We look at the size of the Navajo Nation. Like I said, it's about the size of West Virginia, 27,000 square miles about. And there's one utility across the Navajo Nation that serves all of the people who have piped water and also serves these water hauling stations. So they have a lot going on. They also do electricity, they do internet. So one utility for the entire nation is doing all of these things. And so they're doing a lot with what the limited resources that they have. I'd also say something I would love to talk about at some point is in terms of the policy and legislation around infrastructure development on the Navajo Nation is like historically underfunded. And I
Hmm.
think have seen the impacts of that during COVID, as well as kind of just like underscoring the issues that are already going on there.
Hmm.
Um, Quality wise, I think the thing I think about is the long history of uranium mining on the Navajo Nation. Over around 40 million tons was blasted between 1944 and 1986. And this is all over the Navajo Nation. You have communities in the Southwest and Southeast and the North and Central parts of the Navajo Nation that experience extractive uranium mining. And while that mostly has ended, the legacy of uranium mining still remains in the contamination of soil, but also of water. And so you have families who are living in these communities that were impacted by uranium mining and have water contamination on top of that as well. And then another challenge, I think, with how dispersed the Navajo Nation is. Lots of folks live out. And that's part of the challenge of getting water to some of these folks, whether that be through piped connections or whether that's through water hauling. And like just from source to the final destination, you think about like chlorination or other challenges around making sure that the water quality remains good from point A to point B. So those are just three of, I think, the things that we think about on the Navajo Water Project and that a lot of community members and community leaders have been dealing with and finding solutions to over the years.
Hmm. So a lot of people, most people in this country take clean water for granted, but that's not the case everywhere. And I'd be interested in hearing, what is daily life like for folks on the Navajo Nation dealing with some of these water problems?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. As a non-Indigenous person and someone who hasn't experienced water scarcity or water insecurity, I think I can only speak to what's been shared with me or what I've witnessed while working on the Navajo Nation. I think it really was highlighted and underscored during the pandemic, but a lot of folks who don't have running water haul their water. And so, for example, if you live out in a rural community like Paiute Mesa, which is one of the communities we work in, one of the most beautiful places in this world, I think. I love it on Paiute Mesa, but it's really remote. It's a dirt road down a canyon, over up a mesa, and to haul water means driving around 100 miles one way to like Tuba City, which is the nearest town where you can get water. And so just the cost of time to haul water for your family, let alone haul water for agriculture, other needs that you have for farming, whatever it might be. So that the impact of time on daily life, especially if you have kids or you have a job, then like what does that time burden look like for families? And some folks are definitely closer to watering points like 20 miles away or something like that. But to have to haul water at all is a time burden on community members. And then I also think about and the health and safety of communities and of children and of elders and folks who don't have running water and sanitation facilities. A lot of folks who don't have bathrooms might have like an outhouse. Um, and thinking about not only like the health and safety of folks in using an outhouse, but also like having to walk out in the cold or like having grandma have to like walk out in the middle of the heat of the day or the middle of the cold of the winter, just kind of like the basic needs, and the barriers to getting those met on a daily basis. So time as well as the health and safety of communities. Yeah, I think it's something that when you have water in your tap and you can just like wake up in the middle of the night and go get a glass of water or go use the bathroom, it's totally different to think about not having that immediate access.
Yeah, that's a lot different than most people in this country, the situation they're facing, and you could see how it would be a major challenge just on a daily basis.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you mentioned the pandemic and how it's brought a lot of these issues to the fore. Tell us a little bit more about how COVID has intersected with some of these water security issues.
Yeah, absolutely. We think back to this time last year, and what we were hearing everywhere is, wash your hands, stay home, wear a mask. And washing your hands is really hard when you don't have running water and you have to haul water from the nearest like watering point or border town and have to go into places that are potentially COVID hotspots. And we saw this time last year, May 2020, there was a higher rate of COVID-19 infection per capita on the Navajo Nation than there was in New York City. And it was a really, really hard time for the communities. And it was also one of the places that like Navajo Nation had one of the strictest stay-at-home orders and some of the strictest mask mandates and all of that. And still communities saw such a rampant COVID-19 case rate. Um, and we lost a lot of elders and a lot of community members to COVID-19, and it's had a huge impact on communities for the year and a half, and something that people are still, of course, you know, thinking about and dealing with. And water played, I think, an integral role in why we saw that, as well as other, health impacts and situations on the Navajo Nation. You have food, it's a food desert, and you might have to drive into town to get food and that kind of thing. But you also have to haul water if you don't have running water. And that means, like we were talking about before, driving, 20 miles, 30 miles plus into a town center and interacting with other people potentially. Um, as well as, not, if you do have COVID, not being able to go get running water. And so what happens then if you're quarantined at home and don't have running water? And that's kind of where our team and our project managers, especially who work in their communities, really looked at what was going on and said, we need to do something. We can't just sit back and put all of our projects on hold while we're in this pandemic. This is integral to the work that we're doing. So pretty much overnight, we pivoted to emergency relief work, initially starting out with bottled water donations and just delivering large amounts of bottled water to chapter houses, which are kind of like the local government on the Navajo Nation. And then pivoting to delivering emergency water storage tanks. So 275-gallon big square tanks that we sat outside of folks' homes and did a contactless drop and filled up with water on a regular monthly basis. And we now have over 1,000 storage tanks across the Navajo Nation for COVID relief efforts. And we're phasing out of that now. But for over a year now, we've been placing these storage tanks and filling them up with clean, potable drinking water for families to use. And it's especially in the height of the pandemic, it was really important to be able to deliver water to folks who were quarantined, or deliver water to try to get people to stay home, and also like provide drinking water and hand washing water in a time when that was of the utmost importance.
This is Water Words, a fast explanation of a bit of water lingo. I'm Hannalee Myers. Today's water word is prior appropriation. Prior appropriation is most commonly associated with water law, and Cornell law defines it as a doctrine that uses a priority system, giving the first person to use or divert water for a beneficial use or purpose the ability to acquire individual rights to the water. The phrase most commonly used to explain prior appropriation is first in time, first in right. So, under prior appropriation doctrine, which is how water rights are allocated in most of the Western United States, if a water user has a long history of putting flows to a beneficial use, for example, industrial, agricultural, or household use, that water user's right to the water is senior to the water rights of anyone else who began using the water after them. In the West, where drought and water scarcity mean lots of years, there's just not enough water to go around, a prior appropriation water rights system comes in handy because it makes clear who gets how much of the water that is available. Older senior water rights get priority, while newer junior water rights get what's left. One of the negatives to a prior appropriation water rights system is that water rights that are aimed at keeping water in rivers for recreation or environmental purposes are almost always junior to water rights for farming, industry, and development. So if you hear the term prior appropriation and you think of a legal water rights system, that means those who have used the water longer have more rights to the water than newcomers, you've got it right. That's prior appropriation doctrine. Now back to the Water Buffs podcast.
So these problems with water, the water supply and the quality of the water certainly predate the COVID pandemic. Talk a little bit about some of the roots of this problem. It goes back quite a while. How did the Navajo Nation get into this situation where there are such big challenges in terms of water?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great question. And I would say in general, water rights everywhere, but especially, in the West have a complicated history, and on the Navajo Nation do as well. I think we can think back really, like, to keep it simple, the root of the issues we're seeing now are the legacy of racism and underfunding across the country, specifically for Indigenous communities. The Neck communities or Navajo communities didn't get the same kind of water rights and water infrastructure that the rest of the country saw during those big infrastructure development booms, like during the New Deal or any kind of investment in roads or pipelines or anything like that. And at the same time, throughout history, you had settlers move in and displace and cause a lot of violence in Indigenous communities, as well as change the local ecosystem. So damming and diverting rivers and changing the ways that water just moved across this landscape. And we still see that legacy today with things like the Glen Canyon Dam or other, diversion of water to big cities like Phoenix or Los Angeles or Vegas. So you see this kind of disparity and like also extraction happening at the same time. And historically, though tribes are on paper have like 20% of, for example, like 20% of the Colorado River watershed rights, they're not included in water discussions. They're not brought to the table or not made time to have tribal leaders brought to the table around these discussions. So I think that's kind of like the foundation with which we're working in right now, with this like long history of racism within or against Indigenous communities, as well as now I think we look at the underfunding that's happened in the past, 50, 60 years around infrastructure development. There's a big lack of investment from the federal level within tribal communities, and on the Navajo Nation, I think especially because it's so expansive and it's hard to pipe water to homes that are 20 miles down a dirt road. But IHS, the Indian Health Service, puts out a yearly report where they kind of identify the need within Indigenous communities and tribal nations, and then say how much on a dollar amount it would cost to fix all of these things. So, for example, in 2019, I think the IHS identified need for the Navajo Nation was $2.5 billion, but Congress allotted $192 million. And so we see kind of this acknowledged need of where the need is on the Navajo Nation and then what is actually funded. And I think it's been like that for years. And so you have years after years of underfunding for these water projects or any kind of infrastructure projects. And so there's a lot of identified need, but not a lot of investment happening. And I hope that changes with things like the infrastructure bill and the American Rescue Plan Act and those kinds of things. But at the same time, I think what is identified with like IHS or even, the work that we do, we might know that we have this many homes that don't have running water, but for every one home we see, there might be one or two other homes that haven't been identified. So that it's underfunded, and also the need is probably underestimated.
And you mentioned the infrastructure bill, the legislation in response to the pandemic. it sounds like there is some effort in those bills and legislation to address this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I don't remember. I would have to fact check a little bit how much was allocated for tribal nations for water infrastructure specifically. I think it was $2 billion. I'd have to double check that. But there was money allocated from this legislation for water infrastructure specifically on tribal nations. I think the thing that will be interesting and to see how it plays out is the timeline of that. A lot of times funding, especially from the federal level, has a strict timeline of when it has to be spent. And when you have so much work to get done or a lot of work to invest in these projects on tribal nations and on the Navajo Nation, 2 or 3 years isn't enough time to get all of the preliminary work done that hasn't been able to be funded in the past. So a lot of these projects aren't shovel ready. They haven't had an engineering report. They haven't had all of the assessment needed to be done in order to get things moving. So yeah, there's a lot of, I think, money available, and it would, we need to think about, I think we need to think about how the timelines of those work out.
Mhm. So there's something called the Western Navajo Pipeline. Tell us about that.
Yeah, the Western Navajo Water Pipeline is an initiative to take water from Lake Powell and construct water infrastructure in the communities along the Western Agency within the Navajo Nation, which will help the Navajo Nation not rely on the town of Page for water for these areas. And these areas, which include Bodoe Gap, Cameron, Lachii, are hotspots for lack of water access. So it'll be a really, really great improvement and investment in water on the Navajo Nation on the Western Agency side of things. These will include water treatment plants, water and power lines, new storage tanks, and some of these things, are ready to go right now, and it's in phase 1 of construction. But some of these things will take, up to 6 years or so to complete. So it's something that is coming down the line in terms of increased water capacity on the Navajo Nation, but isn't here yet.
Okay. So you've talked a lot about construction projects. Are there economic benefits, jobs benefits to this work?
Absolutely. I think any kind of investment in infrastructure work on the Navajo Nation will create local jobs, both with, any kind of construction contractor that's doing the work, but as well as long-term of operation and maintenance of these projects. So water utility operators, somebody who's going out and checking the system. We on the Navajo Water Project invest in developing local watering points or small watering points within communities, and that will help create jobs not only for our team in terms of delivering water, but also long-term, what does the long-term maintenance and operations of any local watering source look like? So needing to make sure that the chlorine levels are up to date, that the water tests are being sent into the EPA, those kinds of things, as well as I think on the Navajo Nation developing more capacity for the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority, which is already doing so many things and is underfunded and has a lot of work on their plate as well. So I think creating more capacity for jobs in that space is something that investing in infrastructure on the Navajo Nation will definitely help with. And to kind of think about the work that we're doing within communities, we hire locally folks from the community to do any kind of installation and these water delivery routes. We're also partnering with a Navajo Technical University to start a plumbing school to be able to develop local capacity around plumbing and sanitation.
Interesting. So you mentioned a big issue is funding, and it sounds like the federal government is key source of that funding. Are there other funding sources, like from the state, private foundations? It seems like there's such a huge need. Are there other sources besides the federal government that are potentially able to be used to support this work?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So DigDeep, our funding streams mostly come from foundations as well as private donations. It's actually really incredible. A large amount of our home water systems are funded through individuals who want to give and support a family getting a home water system. So I think, kind of crowdsourcing in that way is one way that nonprofits can help invest in infrastructure on the Navajo Nation. I think in general, like the Navajo Nation's access to funding, they're eligible for federal funding through EPA, HUD, IHS, that kind of thing. And then, like we've been talking about, these most recent infrastructure bills. And those aren't anything that we as DigDeep will, access or even try to, because we have a different allocation of funding that's available to us. So thinking about ways in which we can support, especially the Navajo Nation and leaders on the Navajo Nation who've been doing this work for so long, in kind of those funding gaps. So we recently started a water inspiration fund it's helping to kind of fill those gaps with any kind of community water project to be able to invest in infrastructure and development of water sources.
Mm-hmm. So the challenges that the Navajo Nation are facing, are there similar situations elsewhere in the American West, on Native American reservations or elsewhere where there's such big challenges in terms of the water supply?
I think absolutely, yes. Folks, on the Navajo Nation and in this area, part of the world, have seen a 14-year drought, and we all have, living out west, seen this incredible drought. But if you have your water that turns on, your piped water, you're not thinking about it necessarily as much. Then there are many indigenous communities, Hopi, Zuni, the Pueblos, Wallapai, Apache, that live in these areas and in drought, and also receive or don't receive funding for infrastructure development. I think on the Navajo Nation, it's, gets a lot of, there's a lot of press around it with how big the Navajo Nation is, as well as, like with COVID, how much the Navajo Nation was impacted. But other indigenous communities saw these similar impacts and have seen these similar disparities in terms of investment or lack of investment in infrastructure over the years and during COVID. So absolutely, I think this is a thread of a larger fabric that has been woven throughout history and time with the history of racism against indigenous communities, as well as like kind of the lack of investment in them. And I think, I, again, as a non-indigenous person, can't speak to this first-handedly, but working out west and working with indigenous communities, we see these similar themes around water and infrastructure everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Anything else that you'd like folks to know about your work to address these water issues on the Navajo Nation?
I guess something I didn't talk too much about a little bit in terms of our community partnerships. I think that's a really important piece of the work that we're doing on the Navajo Nation and DigDeep as well. Community leaders and representatives have been figuring out solutions to water in their communities for a long time. Like we have only been working on the Navajo Nation for the past 5 or 6 years. And I think centering those folks who have been thinking about this and doing a lot of work around this is really important to advocate for the solutions that they know are the solutions for their communities. Something I say a lot, and our executive director says a lot, is people are experts in their own experiences. And so making sure that we listen and show up and support what community leaders know to be the solutions for their communities is really important. And for the work that we do and the long-term sustainability and success of these kinds of projects.
Great. Well, it sounds like really important work, and really appreciate you taking time to explain the challenges and the solutions that you're pursuing.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great to talk to you.
Thanks, Kaitlin.
Of course. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Water Buffs podcast, available in audio and video formats on most major media platforms. Water Buffs is a production of The Water Desk, an independent journalism initiative based at the University of Colorado Boulder's Center for Environmental Journalism. You can learn more about us and about water issues at waterdesk.org. We're also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. If you have a comment or have a question, please feel free to email us at waterdesk@colorado.edu. Special thanks to the executive producer and co-manager, Hannah Lee Myers, and to our graphic designer and co-developer, Jeff McGee. Be sure to check out our other episodes, and until next time, thanks for tuning in.